Hi everyone, my name is Dr. Robin Lewis. I'm a naturopathic physician practicing here in Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. And today I want to talk to you about digestion. More specifically, I want to talk to you guys about bloating. Now, digestive issues are very common in modern day lives, and it's estimated that 15 to 30% of the population is bloated at any given time. So this is a very common issue. Now, most of us can understand that if we're bloated after eating a ton of junk food and things like that, then that's normal. But sometimes the bloating isn't that obvious. It's not really linked to eating really poor foods. And sometimes it's not linked to food at all. So today I want to break down for you the top 4 reasons you might be feeling bloated. In general, bloating can be due to 3 main mechanisms. One is increased production of gas. The second is inflammation. And then the third is slowed movement within the digestive tract. Now, all 3 of these things can lead to bloating, but through different mechanisms. Most of us assume that bloating is a gas problem because it feels like you're distended, almost like there's a big bubble inside of your gut. But when they've studied things like irritable bowel syndrome, which is one of the more common functional issues of the gut, they find that despite the fact that these people feel very bloated, they actually don't have an increased production of gas inside of their digestive tract at all. So today we're going to talk about all of the different things that can lead to bloating and how they can kind of look a little different. But before we jump into that, I just want to briefly emphasize why it's important to get on top of this, because bloating can very much go normalized as something that is uncomfortable, but not that important to address. Our gut, the health of our gut, is very cornerstone to our overall health. And bloating is one of the symptoms that our gut is not doing well. Our digestive tract is linked to much more than just digestion. Yes, it's important for us to absorb our nutrients, but it's also important for your nervous system regulation, your mood, autoimmune diseases, other chronic conditions inside of the gut. And in fact, 95% of our serotonin, for example, is made inside of our gut. Now, serotonin is our happy chemical, and it's often linked to depression. So something as seemingly separate as depression can actually start inside of the gut. And so this is just to emphasize why it's important to get on top of these things, because it might start as bloating, but the overall impact it can have on the body is quite large, and certainly can become quite large as we let these things progress. So now that I've kind of emphasized that and gotten that out of the way, let's dive into the top 4 reasons you're feeling bloated. The first one I want to talk about is a big one, and that's because it's one of the more common reasons I see bloating inside of my clinic, and it's because it can make all of the other things that I'm going to mention later a lot worse. So it's often a contributing factor to almost all types of bloating, and that's why I wanted to go over it first. So this is weak digestion. What do I mean by that? Weak digestion is referring to the insufficient production of our digestive juices. So our food needs to be broken down into tiny, tiny little pieces before it's absorbed into the body. And yes, chewing does a good part of that, but the majority of digestion actually happens by things like the stomach acid that we produce, by enzymes that are released by our mouth, our intestines, our pancreas. All of these different things have to break down our food for us. And so for the sake of this section, I'm just going to refer to it as things like enzymes and stomach acid, because digestive juices, for whatever reason, just creeps me out as a word. So that's what I'm going to be referring to when I'm talking about these things that are released to break down your food. Anyways, I digress. There are a lot of things that can dampen the release of our digestive enzymes and our stomach acid. And the reason this is an issue is because obviously the food will just sit there as it's trying to get absorbed. So this will often present as you feeling just really full, distended. It can present as a type of bloating because things are just sitting there. And if they sit there for long enough, they will tend to ferment. Now, the bugs that live inside of our gut, often referred to as our gut microbiome, will have more opportunity to digest the food for you. The problem with that is they often release a lot of gas. So this is where you can get into more of a gas type of bloating. And I'm going to refer to something called S.I.B.O later on in this episode, so I will touch on that a little bit more. You can kind of think about this the same way you would think about how you make things like beer or bread. What you do is you add a yeast, so an organism, to digest some of the carbs in either that beer or that bread, and as a product, they produce a lot of gas. So in the case of beer, it adds fizz into your drink. In the case of bread, it helps that bread rise. And so the same thing can be happening inside of your gut, which is kind of weird to think about. So it's important to make sure that you are releasing enough of these enzymes to break down the food so there is less opportunity for things to sit and ferment. Now, when I tell you one of the most common reasons that these enzymes and stomach acid aren't getting released, you will understand why this is so common. The number one reason this response is getting dampened is stress. I'm sure we can all relate to that one, but stress is really bad for our digestion. One of the main reasons is our gut and our brain have a direct connection called the vagus nerve. Now, this vagus nerve is in charge of whether or not we're in what's called fight or flight or rest or digest. So you can think of this as kind of like our activated, switched on, like gotta fight a tiger kind of mode to our nervous system, or the like cool, chill, hanging out on the couch, not a worry in the world kind of version of our nervous system. Now, if we are in fight or flight, which stress will put us into via the vagus nerve, that is going to direct blood flow and attention to things like our muscles and our brain, because that's what we need to fight off a predator. Digestion is a pretty low priority when you're in this mode. It's going to shut down the production of digestive enzymes in response to food. So this is why it's really important to not eat on the go, have mindful practices around eating, not eating and taking your lunch at your desk when you're trying to do work. All of these sort of things put you in a more stressed state, and we do not release these enzymes as well as we could when we're in this state. Now, stress isn't the only thing that can dampen the release of these things, but it certainly is a very common one. It's important to note that, of course, it could have more to do with the organs that release these enzymes directly. So things like our liver, our pancreas, our gallbladder, our saliva glands, things like that. So the issue can be there, but certainly stress is the most common cause of weak digestion. Now, let's move on to the gut microbiome, as I was mentioning earlier, more specifically something called S.I.B.O. Now, S.I.B.O stands for small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, which, as the name kind of suggests, it's a bacterial overgrowth that lives in your small intestine. The small intestine is where we do the majority of the breakdown of our food. And so when we get overgrowths of these particular bugs, it can create a lot of bloating because of this fermentation process that I mentioned earlier. These particular bugs that are associated with S.I.B.O are very high gas producing bugs. So they produce a lot of hydrogen and methane and things like that. And so this is the type of bloating picture where someone is going to feel, yes, visibly distended, bloated, but you're going to have a lot of gas. So a lot of belching, a lot of farting. This is a very gassy type of bloating. So it's not particularly subtle. So these are people who will feel bloated and gassy after every single thing that they eat. And this can get to the point where it's debilitating. You know, if you're gonna have to pass gas every second of every day, you're going to stop going out. You're going to stop hanging out with people because eventually something is going to come out and it's going to be embarrassing. So this is really the type of picture that is related to something like SIBO. And depending on the type of SIBO, because there can be multiple different bugs involved, you can get also constipated or you could get diarrhea. It can vary in some of the other symptoms, but bloating tends to be the common denominator. Bloating and gas is very much a SIBO picture. If you've ever heard of something like the FODMAP diet, this is usually being used in regards to something like SIBO. So the FODMAP diet essentially eliminates short chain carbohydrates that these bugs really like to eat for fuel. So of course, if we reduce the amount of foods that these bugs eat, you will get less gas. So this diet can be really helpful for this particular type of bloating. That being said, SIBO is much more resilient than that. You often have to take other measures in order to fully get rid of the problem. But if you respond to something like a FODMAP diet, this might be what's causing your bloating. So of course, I don't have time to go into all of the different types of microbiome issues that can lead to digestive upset, but SIBO is a very common cause of bloating, so I just wanted to make sure that you guys are aware of this one. And it's also important to note that it's really hard to know what type of SIBO you have, so this is really where testing can be useful. So depending on the type of SIBO you have, different therapies might work better for you versus others. So if you really are convinced that SIBO might be the cause of some of your bloating issues or other digestive issues, please go get it tested before engaging in treatment. And if you do, you can get super specific about it and hopefully get rid of your bloating. Okay, the third thing that I want to mention is food sensitivities. So not to be confused with food allergies, which are a much more severe reaction. So you can always think of like peanut allergies, right? Like throat closing up, hives everywhere. That's a food allergy. Food sensitivities are lower grade reactions to food that create inflammation inside of the digestive tract and inflammation inside of the whole body. The main reason something like this can lead to bloating is because it's creating inflammation inside of your digestive tract. So this is one of those non-gas producing causes of bloating. So it's not to say that you won't have the occasional bout of gas, but it's definitely not to the same extent as something like SIBO. It's more of a discomfort, a distension. You probably don't look visibly bloated, but you feel really uncomfortable, which in some people, that can kind of be perceived as a bloating-like sensation. Now, of course, things like food sensitivities aren't the only type of food reaction that can create inflammation inside of the gut. Another really good example of this is something like celiac disease, which is actually an autoimmune reaction to gluten. This too will create inflammation inside of the gut. In fact, it creates a lot of inflammation inside of the gut. And this is a very destructive type of condition, and it usually leaves people malnourished because their gut is so inflamed and things are really not absorbing. Now you might think, well, if my gut's that inflamed, I probably know about it. Well, that's actually not the case for a lot of people. Something like celiac disease, which is a big inflammatory condition of the gut, is often not diagnosed until the 4th or 6th decade of life. That is the average time of diagnosis. So you can have inflammation of the gut that is going undetected for a long period of time. And certainly with something like food sensitivities, because the inflammation is usually not that severe, it can be even more subtle. And to throw an even further wrench into it, the symptoms of food sensitivity can be quite broad. So yes, bloating is one of them, but it can also give you symptoms outside of the digestive tract. So things like headaches, skin breakouts, brain fog, things like that. It's because it's creating a local inflammatory reaction that does lead to systemic whole body inflammation if it goes unchecked and if you continue to unknowingly eat these foods. So again, like S.I.B.O, you want to test for it. Because the symptoms can be quite broad, they don't follow a super crystal clear symptom picture, and they can present on a bit of a spectrum. So you can have mild sensitivities and more severe sensitivities. So for this reason, it can be really challenging for you to pinpoint it to that exact food without a test. There are things like food elimination diets where you can really trial and error this. I will say they're not my favorite because they require a lot of compliance for people, and diet is already hard enough. But that is also an alternative if you don't want to pay for testing. But nonetheless, food sensitivities are a very common cause of bloating inside of the digestion. All right, last thing here before we let you go, I want to dive into how your nervous system, the nervous system of your gut, can also create bloating. So this is referring to something called the migrating motor complex, or the MMC for short. So this is an electrical wave that migrates through the small intestines and it'll propel your food forward. So there's contractions that happen inside of your gut to keep things moving along. So this is when I was referring to in the beginning as the slowing of digestion. This slows digestion if it's not working properly. If the contractions aren't moving things along well, then things get backed up and S.I.B.O can happen and all of these different things can happen. But the cause has more to do with damage to the nerves rather than strictly a bacterial overgrowth or something like that. So all of these things can really interplay with each other, but it's really about finding out what the root cause of the problem is. Because if I try to address the bugs, for example, without addressing the nervous system, then you're only going to get so far when it comes to improvement of symptoms. So this migrating motor complex can get damaged for a lot of different reasons. One of the main reasons that you can get damage to this complex, this nervous system inside of your gut, is something like food poisoning. So when you get an infection, a gut infection of something like E. coli, it can create a ton of damage and inflammation while it's active in your system. And sometimes it's damaging that nervous system. So this is probably one of the more common causes of something like damage to the MMC. And if you have had food poisoning and then the bloating started after that, then you can kind of piece together the puzzle. Now, it's not the only thing that can damage your nervous system. You also want to be thinking about issues of the nervous system as a whole. So we have nervous system disorders like Parkinson's, like MS. We have the nerve damage that can happen as a product of diabetes, B12 deficiencies, things like that. If it affects the nerves in the fingers of your toes, it can definitely affect the nervous system of your gut. And so bloating might be one of the first signs of this nerve damage. Of course, with these more severe conditions like MS, as it progresses, you're going to find more of like a constipation, the full backlog as the damage occurs. But something like bloating can be an early sign that things are just not moving very well in the system. And of course, if something like these nervous system disorders are already on your radar and you're getting bloating, then this might be related to each other. So these are just things to think about when it comes to addressing your bloating. It's not always super straightforward. So I hope that you found today's information helpful. I really hope that this got the wheels turning in your brain as to what's causing your bloating, because if you understand what's causing it, then you can come up with really targeted treatment plans for it. You will have a totally different treatment plan if it's something like S.I.B.O versus stress-induced weak digestion. And really that's where good medicine is. So thank you guys again for listening. As always, if there's anything else that you want me to dive into, let me know. If you have questions or comments, please comment them below. I appreciate all of your support and have your guys' self a great week.